Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day it happens to be while you're watching. My name is Matt Doyle. I'm a UK-based author, occasional voice actor. I've also done little pieces of art, game programming and whatnot. This is my Cabinet of Curios, the show where I look at horror media that is a little bit unusual or obscure, or in some cases that I just feel is unfairly criticised. The first two episodes, we looked at Gorgo and Outcast, which are both British productions and full-length movies. We're going to take a slightly different approach this time and look at the 1998 TV miniseries, Peter Benchley's Creature. So, much like most Peter Benchley things that you would have heard of in terms of film and TV, this was actually based on one of his books. Now, I need to make the little caveat here that I have never actually read the original book. So what I'm going to say right now in terms of differences between the two is based purely on what I've been able to research on the internet. The novel was eventually re-released as Creature to tie in with the miniseries, but was originally called White Shark. The story of that begins at the close of World War II with some Nazi scientists creating a weapon called Der Weiße Hai, or White Shark, and placing it in a coffin-like container. The container is transported via submarine, but the Allies sink the sub before it can deliver the weapon, and many years later some unsuspecting divers come across the box and recover it, inadvertently releasing the creature into the waters around Long Island. Marine biologist Dr. Simon Chase examines the divers' bodies and proclaims they can't have been killed by a shark as the wounds contain traces of metal. A Holocaust survivor who was forced to assist with the experiments then later reveals that Der Weiße Hai is actually an SS officer / ex-Olympian who was implanted with steel teeth and claws and was genetically altered to be able to breathe underwater before being placed in hibernation in the coffin. It's explained that the creature was taught to drain his lungs and breathe air, but not how to reverse the process, meaning it cannot return to the water once it maps the land. Later, Dr. Chase lures the creature into a decompression chamber and explodes it. The miniseries, however, begins during the Vietnam War. A government facility on a remote Caribbean island has been experimenting with hybrids. This includes dolphin sharks that are as smart as dolphins and as deadly as sharks, and they intend to use them as weapons to do things like placing mines on submarines and the such like. They also have a shark-human hybrid that, after killing a scientist, manages to escape. One of the soldiers chases it down, captures it, but rather than killing it as ordered, he dumps it in the sea. 25 years later, marine biologist Dr. Chase and his assistant Toolman, and yes, the character's name is literally Toolman, and he is a tall man, so makes sense. They're studying sharks in an attempt to unlock the secret of why sharks don't die from cancer. After the dumped container that contained the creature is found open, a man dies. Dr. Chase declares the kill was not made by the pregnant great white he's been studying. The locals disagree and go hunting anyway. Dr. Chase's estranged wife, Dr. Macy, and their son Max arrive, and we learn that the research base that he's now working on is the now abandoned government facility from the start of the movie. The bodies start to pile up, and after Dr. Chase contacts the Navy, soldiers are dispatched to kill the creature. A local man nicknamed Werewolf, who is not a werewolf at all, he just occasionally goes, "Oh," and things like that. He comes to the facility and shows Dr. Chase and Dr. Macy a secret tunnel, inside which they find research notes and equipment, and are then attacked by the creature. Lots more people die, the heroes get injured. We learn that Werewolf is actually Lieutenant Peniston, the soldier that dumped the creature in the sea. The creature is lured into a pressure chamber and exploded. So, as you can see, the core story is actually similar, but not identical. For example, the change in war setting, I suspect, was likely due to the Vietnam War being a little fresher in people's minds than World War II. History teaching on wars is kind of hit and miss, I find, certainly over here, but you do tend to learn more about the most recent conflict that your country was involved in. The biggest change is the design of the monster. In the book, what it sounds like to me is Jaws from James Bond, but with metal claws and gills, which is fine. Certainly, if you saw that coming towards you, it would be plenty scary. The one in the miniseries I actually thought was more impressive. This is pretty much an anthropomorphic, muscular shark. And it was actually brought to life with the help of the legendary Stan Winston. Actually, to me, it is an absolute thing of beauty. It toes the line between expressive movements and slightly mechanical motions that kind of makes you think of Winston's work on things like Jurassic Park. If you're a fan of practical effects, like I am, it's absolutely worth watching the creatures just to see this thing in action. It looks really good, and they do such a good job of not letting you see a full shot of it until the final scenes of the first of the two parts. And there's plenty of shock there too, seeing it violently retch up the liquid from its lungs before marching menacingly towards the protagonist in a claustrophobic hallway is really well done. And that's a good thing, because the film received a 12 rating in the UK, which would be the equivalent, I think, of a PG-13 in the US. TV movies with this rating, I find, sometimes try to get away with a little less than the cinema releases do. What that means here is we don't actually see too much in the way of the creature's attacks. There's enough gore to feel like death is a constant, and we certainly see moments of the attacks, such as someone being dragged under and, doing the flailing in the water and things like that. But graphic kills are not the thing here. It's not trying to be a sort of in-your-face thing like that. The one exception is the creature's ultimate end, because you have to have that one in-your-face moment, and it makes sense they would build up to it at the end. It's honestly not a great effect at that time, but TV monster movie CG is what it is. But what this means is, instead of showing the violence in all its glory, the series sets about giving us moments that are designed to be creepy instead. Now, this is where the series kind of wears its influences on its sleeve. There are a few moments that you will absolutely recognise as being lifted from bigger productions. The obvious would be Peter Benchley's most famous adaptation, Jaws. There are also scenes, though, that you could see lifted from the likes of Alien or Predator. My favourite, though, and I may be a little bit off base with this, but it was the feel of the government facility. In the first part of the series, the scenes there, it gave me a distinct air of the original 1996 video game, Resident Evil. And the game was huge and kind of helped spawn what we know as survival horror now. And it feels like that didn't go unnoticed here. You could argue that it was in some ways a very generic military research facility, but there's something about the layout and the way the shots are framed that just put me in mind of running around as Claire Redfield and Jill Valentine in my teens. That the camera angles and the things like that feel like those fixed cameras from those old games. Then in the second part, the facility kind of maintains this tone, but the stalked by the creature nature of the final conflict begins to take on a vague sense of drawing influence from the final chase through the factory in the original Terminator. Which, of course, we mentioned this briefly, actually, the first time I was on Visited by Voices. The original Terminator, not entirely a horror, but I do myself feel that it has elements of it, and that kind of stalky nature kind of comes into play here. In that sense, you could absolutely argue that the series begs, borrows, and steals enough to be an amalgamation of familiar things being worn like a flesh suit, screaming that stuff was great, so this must be great too. Which is a hell of an image. But in my opinion, it is actually genuinely great, and not just because of the effects and borrowed scenes, though. See, there are different rules for TV movies and cinema releases. If you placed a sci-fi original up against the equivalent bigger production, it would be very easy to tell the difference in most cases. I mean, if we're sticking with sharks, for example, if you were to place Sharknado next to, let's avoid the obvious with Jaws, Deep Blue Sea, they're both a little bit cheesy, but they both have very different rules about how they're supposed to work. The way TV movies are shot is different, and just like you find familiar jump scares in modern horror cinema, you will find familiar ways of framing scenes on TV. And they have a very distinct feel to their soundtrack too that you don't really find in the cinema. The acting is also more likely to be on the cheesy side, usually in line with the story being the same, and that's not to knock TV movie actors, because there are some very well done pieces. Obviously, I do class this as one of them. But I think it would be fair to say that perhaps, at least in part to do with the scripting in that sort of production, it tends to stray away from being too serious in comparison. Peter Benchley's creature almost breaks the rules. Almost. If we start with the soundtrack, it is placed in the scenes in a way that's in line with what you expect. It's more obtrusive than audio production in a strong cinema release. But somehow it doesn't always sound like it should be a TV production. I'm convinced the team sort of maybe contained a few gamers, because there are moments that for me, seem to draw inspiration from, of all things, Final Fantasy VII. I don't mean you'll hear it and say, hey, is that Nobuyo Uematsu? It's more that there'll be little bursts that if you told me they were from a Final Fantasy VII fan game, honestly, I would believe you, because it feels like it's someone trying to capture that. Whereas the main theme is a strange mix of tribal tones and something that borders on being tonally similar to Michael Shields' work on the Ginger Snaps theme. And that ties in well with the themes of the story without being too cliched, because there's a definite message here about the value and dangers of traditional belief systems. The islanders, for example, mistrust outsiders. They view them as being representative of the antithesis of how they live. To that end, Dr. Chase and Dr. Macy are actually accused of witchcraft at one point, and we see plenty of scenes that show tribal dances centered on sharks. It is worth noting, this is not entirely accurate for reality. Caribbean culture had a lot of different religious aspects in play, ranging from Christianity over to Vodun. Shark worship was more common among Hawaiian and Fijian cultures. It clearly fits with the concept of what the film was going for, or the miniseries rather was going for here. So there is a little bit of cross-culture shenanigans being carried out. Is that problematic by modern standards? That's really up to you to decide. I think it would be a fair argument if you wanted to make it. This was a different time, though, so I don't think people really had that much care about it. And, as I say, it does fit with the film, or the series, and it does make sense that sharks were at the very least revered. They were hunters in the local waters, so they were a danger to the local people, especially fishermen and divers. So when the white man comes along and says, hey, sharks are the good guys, that's not going to be taken well. That mistrust expands beyond the locals, too. See, the police chief, we learn, was viewed as an outcast when he first came to the island because he wasn't of local origin. So when he became the police chief, he started carrying out his job in a way that he assumes the locals want him to. He does this as a way to fit in and deflect the mistrust elsewhere, which puts him at odds with Dr. Chase. No matter how much evidence or logic there is to what Dr. Chase is saying, he sticks, at least initially, fervently to what he believes is the local viewpoint. The bridge between the cultures is Toolman, who's indigenous to the islands, but views Dr. Chase as being quite noble and smart. And interestingly, the battle of him trying to reconcile his heritage and his job is kind of portrayed through his relationship with his girlfriend, Torna, who leans more towards the traditional side, though not as much as the elder members of the tribe. Then there's Lieutenant Peniston. He's been driven mad from guilt, and while this may well be in part because he helped create the creature that is killing everyone, you get the impression he's been like this for a long time, meaning it probably goes a bit deeper than that. When he dumps the creature in the sea at the start of the film, he does actually yell to it, I'm sorry. We learn later on that the reason for this is that his DNA was used to give the creature its human side. To him, the creature is part him, so he felt bad about trapping it and dumping it. Then when it comes back, he has to face the reality of what he made. And in the end, he actually insists on being locked in the pressure chamber with the creature because he says he can't bear to let it die alone. And this comes across like a mix of maybe atoning for the sin of creating it, but also atoning for the sin of abandoning it alone beneath the sea for 25 years. What we end up with is a fairly healthy mix of messages here. We have atonement, we have tradition being shown to be based in reality, we have the dangers of mistrusting someone for their differences. The execution isn't always the classiest, but it's a little deeper than TV movies often go, I find. At the same time, for all the ways the first half comes across like it's trying to be something more than it is, the second half feels more like a TV movie. Still not entirely, but more so than the first part. You get more of the typical TV movie shots, for example, like the sudden zoom in on the eyes and the expression that kind of feels like it's just come out of nowhere. The creature's death is definitely more TV movie than the other scenes that feature it. You know, as I said, rather than using the wholly practical effect for it, it's the TV CG, which is aged about as well as you would expect. One thing that's consistent, though, is actually the acting, and it's a really, really good cast. Dr. Chase is played by Craig T. Nelson, who was in both Poltergeist and The Devil's Advocate, and he is on absolutely fine form as the frustrated doctor and comes across as very human and likeable. His estranged wife, Dr. Macy, is played by the Golden Globe winner Kim Cattrall, who is perhaps best known for her work on Sex and the City. There is one moment in part 2 where she goes into full-on over-the-top mode for a moment, and it's kind of jarring because it does, again, it kind of comes out of nowhere, and all of a sudden she's chewing the scenery in that one, and then she's back to normal. But other than that, her performance here is absolutely fine. The main soldier, Richland, is played by Colm Feore, who's been everything from the Chronicles of Riddick to the TV series The Borgias. He plays the role in a way that you'd expect someone to play a high-ranking soldier in a movie by The Asylum, or maybe even just maybe a Carnosaur sequel. But he does so seriously that it works here, and it comes across like it's a natural fit for that world rather than being a bit of a cheese fest. Cress Williams, who went on to play Black Lightning, is excellent as Toolman. He comes across as very sympathetic, but also strongly masculine without going overboard. And Giancarlo Esposito of Breaking Bad fame gives us the most over-the-top performance in the series as Peniston. He seems to be really, really enjoying the, like pushing along in his little boat and doing that, oh, you know, he's having a whale of a time there. But because he's the only one that goes to that level, it works. And it kind of then has an impact when he goes back to the more serious end of things towards the end. It's absolutely a cut above many of the successful and fun TV movies in recent years. You know, for example, Darkbreed. I had a lot of fun with Darkbreed, but it has absolutely nothing on this one. Nothing. Creature is so much above it, you wouldn't think it was from the same sort of era. That's not to say there aren't issues, though. There are some odd little moments in there. To give you some examples, there's a scene where the soldiers are trying to track the creature down underneath the facility, and the soldiers are streaming this to Richland using their body cameras, and they seem to go from completely static to completely mobile, just sort of like that, which obviously isn't really how it's going to work. You would see some movement with the body cam. Rope that's inexplicably long for no reason other than to create a certain scene that certainly exists in the movie. It's that sort of thing. If you don't like animal deaths, there is a supporting cast member here that you are not going to enjoy the fate of. It's a very cute little cast member, and it's probably, even though again you don't really see too much, is one of the more graphic moments in that respect that you're going to see in the movie. So, where does that leave the creature? Despite all these little oddities, I feel like it really is something special. It's not Jaws. It's really not Jaws, not even close, but I don't think anybody would really expect it to be, even seeing Peter Benchley's name attached. There is no way you see the synopsis to this film and think, wow, we've got another Jaws on our hands. Not unless you're incredibly naive or optimistic. That being said, I did not think it would come this close to elevating itself above the usual TV fare. I picked this up on DVD, which you can see here, after I saw a picture of the creature on the Stan Winston School of Special Effects YouTube channel. It's one I haven't seen before. I actually intended to do a different film for this episode, but the design of the creature attracted me enough to give it a shot. And when I saw it, I just thought, no, do you know what? I'm going to have to talk about this, because this mini-series really took me by surprise. Splitting it into 2 movie-length pieces really helped, because it meant the pacing could be slowed in an appropriate manner. Even then, if you watch it all in one go, it's going to take you a little over 3 hours, but for me personally, that's sped by. This is, to me, an absolutely upper tier TV movie in 2 parts. The creature's great, the acting is better than you'd expect, and the story is cliched, but it has enough depth to kind of rise above those cliches. If you prefer your killer sharks to be scary or upright walking, big upright walking buff buggers rather than tornado dwellers, in fact, this would absolutely be for you. It does, of course, show that whenever it comes to either Nazi experiments or studying sharks for cancer, that it's never going to turn out well. But I think those are messages that we could probably all get on board with in terms of horror films. So let me know what you think about this one in the comments. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Do you agree with me that it's a little bit more than it should be? If you don't, that's absolutely fine. By all means, tell me why you think it's terrible. I'm all up for hearing other opinions on this one, because I am aware that I do tend to find enjoyment in the strangest of things sometimes. But other than that, I really enjoyed it. I really do recommend it. So if you haven't seen it and you happen to find a copy in the wild going cheap, please do give it a shot and come back to this and let me know what you think. But I think that's about it. So, until next time. Later.